G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far that you are having a fantastic Wednesday, that we are halfway through the week. Now legends, as always, of course, there is a lot to go over and today is no exception. Of course, there's even more than usual. Of course, we've had the talks in Saudi Arabia between the US and Russia and of course Ukraine. They're not really happy about this. And of course, we've had Trump at a press conference make some very, very heated comments about Ukraine and what the future is going to be there. So of course we need to talk about all of that as things are really, really heating up. Of course we'll have a look at the maps and compare different maps. But I also want to talk to you about propaganda, false flags, and nuclear escalation, de-escalation, saber rattling as well. Now, of course, what we see in the informational space, there's a lot of it. We have Trump making comments, we have Zelensky making comments, Putin, Lavrov, European Union, all of this around what's happening in Saudi Arabia and the war as a whole. And what I'll say is the propaganda space is super, super hot at the moment. And of course, there's different sides of this. Ukraine and its allies are trying to salvage the current situation, and other sides are trying to exploit and capitalize on this and push narratives of defeat. And what I'll say is all of this currently is in overdrive. So just be aware of this, be careful what you read, listen to online, in the papers, whatever. It's incredibly hard. I do this for a full-time job and shit, I am not immune to this either. I say as I see it, but of course you're influenced from a whole bunch of factors, from environmental to absolutely everything. But what I will bring up at the moment as well is I believe the threat of false flags is at an extremely critical level. But I want to go over different types of these as well. Now, before we get into any of this, I actually want to talk about propaganda and false flags and people's claims of nuclear escalation as well. Now, that last bit doesn't really make sense at this point, but let's go over propaganda. Now, why do we see a sudden increase in propaganda when we see attritional protracted war? Now, here's a list you've probably seen before. Morale management. Trying to bolster your own population's morale or sustain morale within your armed forces. You could be a perception of weakness. Increase in propaganda signal that a side is experiencing setbacks. So if we see a side increase in this, it could be telling of what's behind the scenes, shaping international opinion and securing more international support, whether it be diplomatic, economic, or military, or a combination of all. Could be justification for escalation, retreat, or controversial tactics. You could be targeting an opponent's morale. This attempts to exploit weaknesses such as political divisions or war fatigue to destabilize enemy cohesion. Now, this is exactly what I see the Russians are trying to do at the moment. They are trying to exploit all of this morale in Ukraine and in, of course, the European Union after these meetings that have been taken place, and as well as Trump statements. So this is all in this informational propaganda warfare. It's hard. The difference between informational and propaganda is so hard to tell just in something like this. Shifts in strategy. A pivot to heavy propaganda could reflect a broader strategic shift where psychological operations are becoming a central aspect of their war effort. This might be if direct military victories are proving elusive. And we've seen this very much so since Ukraine's failed 2023 counteroffensive. Military victories have proven to be very elusive, and propaganda, informational, psychological operations have proven to be a central aspect of this. We'll speak more on that in a second. Escalation or desperation. This might be a final push to rally all resources and intimidate opponents into negotiations. Resource allocation indicators. It may indicate that resources are being funneled into informational warfare, suggesting either confidence in its effectiveness or a lack of capacity to escalate through other means, such as military hardware or support. Okay, so that's why we may see an increase. But what then makes effective propaganda? Now, of course, this is by an evil bastard, but his concept of propaganda, which we know, although I hope people don't agree with, it was very successful in changing public opinions. Now, what is said here is that effective propaganda is that the right idea must be set forth in the appropriate ways. In other words, the secret of propaganda is to tell the truth, but in the appropriate form. So you are presenting truthful information in a strategically designed manner to influence and control public perception and behaviour. And what this can do is the media, that then affects public opinion, that then affects democratic voting, and then that then affects the regimes in power. And so full circle on all of this. The media has far more power, and bloggers online now wield far more power than people actually take into account. And what I say here, and I'm about to show you this, that Ukraine was actually initially too successful with this. Can you be too successful? Well, wait a second. Now, the truth is that initially Russia took huge losses, but the idea was spread that Russia was then conventionally, militarily destroyed and defeated. And this went all the way to the top of NATO, all the way to the top of the European Union. And what this did was this led to command and political complacency. Therefore, it led into a lack of accountability, which has now led into the manpower shortages and command issues that we are currently seeing. Now, I have a really, really great piece coming this weekend, and this is just a snippet of it. Now, you will know who this is. I'm not going to say at the moment. I'm doing a little bit of teaser here, but I think you'll get a hell of a lot out of this. Now, Ukraine was also way ahead of Russia in showing off battlefield successes. Ukrainian forces flooded social media with videos of destroyed Russian vehicles and captured tanks being pulled by farmers. Remember, needs to be truth, but set forward in the appropriate way. Meanwhile, Russia relied on these daily briefings, where he basically gloriously announced Ukrainian losses in the thousands with little to back it up. Of course, which one trended better through media to population to then down the line? But as I said, propaganda is a double-edged sword. Over time, it started working against Ukraine, making self-reflection harder. When the situation in Bakhmut was deteriorating, and our team was informed that casualty rates in close-quarters combat weren't anywhere near the 1-to-10 or 1-to-20 ratios, as some officials and analysts claimed, it became obvious that propaganda was getting people killed. It downplayed how bad things were and delayed the decision to withdraw from a semi-encirclement. Essentially, propaganda started to cover up leadership mistakes, making them feel a lack of accountability for the decisions. No matter what, the mantra was, trust the ZSU. And this is where it can go into this idea that wasn't Russia strategically defeated? Aren't they out of missiles? And now we're seeing that double-edged sword due to how much success that had. And the reason I pull this out is just to try and give you guys a bit of an idea of when we might see and why we might see an increase in that propaganda, what is going to be effective use case of that, so you can try and see through some of it. But also, I think people need to be held account for some of the information they have pushed that they know is blatantly incorrect, that has caused significant loss on the front line and maybe led to complacency in command or politics that has led to the situation, of course, that we are in. Now, I'm going to go over the maps because that'll be quick. Make sure you hang around for my piece on false flags here. I did a lot of effort into that. It took me a long time. So, of course, in the maps, we have Ukraine center screen, the capital of Kyiv. Now, this map has not updated today, but we do have another number of updates for you. The red, which is occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Now, where we need to come is down into Kharkov. Now, we know that a lot of maps are showing that this has now closed up. I believe that most likely to be true. But a lot of maps are reporting now another pocket has formed around Constantinople to Ulaki. So let's have a look at this. Now, these will show vastly different. This is a Russian map. This is Divgen. So we have Ulaki, which is right in here, and then Constantinople, which is in here. Now, what this map is claiming, and I've seen a lot of other mappers claiming this, is a second pocket now has formed in this, and some are saying that this whole area is in a sort of quicker collapse than we have seen for a while. So watch out for that. Now, of course, we have on this map another pocket to the north of Andriivka. Now, what Divgen is claiming is that this has then filled in here. Now, I wouldn't be surprised, just due to how this is looking on this map, if this is the next update we get for the deep state map, but definitely a critical situation in all aspects on this front line. And to be honest, it couldn't come at a better time for Russia to have large advancements for the Russian narrative going into negotiations, talks with the US, because then they can pull up, well, look what happened today and look what has happened the last few weeks. Now we'll come down to just the west of here, and of course we've got Velyka Novosilka. Now, of course, this map hasn't updated, but we do have the awfully reliable Syriac maps. Now, we just need to zoom out one. It's going to be slightly difficult to see, but we have then Novosilka, which is this road heading up, and this red dot here. Then we have in the middle here towards Burlatsky, and then we have, of course, where Novaya Komar is, and more areas filling in. So on 3 different axes in here, this is where Syriac is saying that the Russians have made ground in the areas of which I was showing you. So wait out on this, but more movements in here. And we wouldn't be surprised seeing the recent movements in here. We know that Russia is definitely allocating resources and forces to that front line. Maybe it's the same, but have rotated into rest after Velyka Novosilka and are back on for assault operations. So just keep an eye on that. Now we'll come to Toretsk. Now no changes shown on this map for a long time, but we do believe that Toretsk is most likely has come under occupation, or at least the majority of it. Now, one of the reasons we think this is because there's been no recent updates. This may say that Russia has really stopped pushing in Toretsk itself due to the capture, is resting for maybe further pushes, or for the situation on the western flank to improve. But we do know, and I showed you the other day, that there was geolocations right up in around here of Ukrainian drones dropping weapon systems on Russian soldiers. And we see this today. During the last 4 days, Russian army advanced northwest of Leonidivka and captured new areas of Novopatsky, taking control over 40% of the locality. So this is, of course, not easy to see, but we need to line up where these mines are in here, and this is talking right up in this area. So you're level with these. Now, other maps are showing advancements here, but again, we can't confirm it till we get good geolocations, as well as confirmations on not just neutral, but also Ukrainian maps. So I'm talking like things like Deep State NOEL reports, things like this. Now, in the northeastern corner, we have another update in here. Now, this isn't that easy to see, but what we look at is that this is Kupiansk, and we have Olenivka, which is right in here. So just about here somewhere. Of course, this is very, very difficult to actually line up exactly where this is, but just in here somewhere, there has at least claimed to be some Russian advancement. I'll try and get more information exactly what that is and maybe have a better look. Now, before we go into the false flags and nuclear escalation, I want to look at these talks that took place between the US and Russian delegations in Saudi Arabia. We're going to have a summary of it, and then we'll look at comments made after it and comments made by President Trump. So this is just a quick summary. Now, what needs to be said? People say Ukraine wasn't invited to this. Now, I don't know if that is completely correct. We knew these meetings were going on. So when someone says, even if it's Zelensky says, we didn't know this meeting was happening, that's bullshit, because I knew it was going on before this happened, and Zelensky was asked if he would be attending or not. If Ukraine was invited or not, that's still grey area for me, because we've seen Trump say he'd like Ukraine to be there. But again, this wasn't peace talks. It said no, it was talks to see if Russia was actually serious to end the war. Anything further than that, Ukraine need to be involved. But we needed to have bilateral relations with them first to say, are you even serious about doing this? This took place over a 4.5 hour meeting. Now, some of the takeaways in this, that US will say that both countries will name high-level teams to move forward on these negotiations. Trump says he's confident after the talks he will meet with Putin before the end of the month. We've heard that both from the US and from Russia. Ukraine, not at the talks, rejects deal without its consent. Again, this goes back into my top point here. Marco Rubio says Russians ready to engage, that no one will be sidelined. Russia demands NATO cancel the 2008 promise of Ukrainian membership, of course, into NATO. Now, one of the big ones in this, though, is the United States and Russia have spoken about being partners geopolitically and economically. Now, this is as we have predicted in the start, talking about the move of Russia towards China and how that really, really threatens US global hegemony. Spoken about oil and competitiveness in Europe, or energy as well, of course, gas too. We've spoken about, of course, nuclear armament and entanglement and Arctic powers as well. So that is all important stuff in that summary, and we'll break some of those down a little bit further. The Trump administration will also be looking to expand geopolitical and economic relations with President Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. Rubio didn't go into detail on this or when they would agree to lift sanctions that have been put on Russia, but said that at some point the European Union is going to have to be at the table because they too have strict sanctions in place. So at least some sanctions are looking like they may be lifted. Now, of course, Russia is a major Arctic power, and we know due to climate change, due to many different factors, the resources available in there, the North Sea route out through Suez Canal or around the bottom is becoming then more available for ships, and the major power in there currently is Russia, even down to the nuclear icebreakers. And China is a near Arctic power, and what we have said is I believe Trump's calculus is that he will forego Ukraine at 20% of their land and maybe NATO membership to try and draw Russia out of China's orbit currently, because that itself is a large problem for the US. And that's a problem the US has to think about that other smaller players may not. It also needs to take into account nuclear entanglement, getting tangled up in something you really don't want to when you have bombs flying. And as I spoke, European competitiveness for raised energy prices and the ability for America to meet the LNG requirements of Europe as well. So there's a lot in that, but that itself is not something I think many are surprised by that. I'm not surprised at all. I've been saying this for a while that I believe we will see America, as we have, try and build a relationship back with Putin. This doesn't mean they're kumbaya around the campfire and hand shanties all around on Red Square. What this means is China is the threat to US. Who fixes a lot of China's problems? It is Russia. Can we draw them back into some orbit of control so sanctions in the future may actually do something? Mike Waltz, Mr. Trump's national security advisor, Steve Witkoff, and the Middle East envoy, and a longtime friend of Mr. Trump, joined Marco Rubio in the meeting, and he called the meeting positive, upbeat, and constructive. The Russian delegation, they've said that there was good food, they said there was tasty lunch, there's a lot of jokes, and they discussed preparations for the meeting between Trump and Putin. Russia appeared to be using Tuesday's talks to cater to Mr. Trump's increase in profits and natural resources, arguing that American oil companies and others stood to gain hundreds of billions of dollars by doing business with Russia, and they want to restart economic cooperation, rebuild communication, rebuild trust, rebuild success. If that economic cooperation comes in, sanctions are going to have to be then lifted. US oil majors had very successful business in Russia, and we know that. It was in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And then Mr. Dmitriev, of course, one of the Russian delegations there, has said, we believe at some point they will be coming back, because why would they forego these opportunities that Russia gave them to have access to Russian natural resources? And this could pave the way for the US to lift severe sanctions imposed by the Biden administration. The same bloke has said that American companies lost around $300 billion by leaving Russia. And this is something that I'll speak about on the weekend with some of the information I've got sent across, is one of the problems of these sanctions is it's sort of known that they are going to end at some point, and a lot of those oligarchs who people expected to sort of rise up against Putin, they just know if they just hang in there that the risk versus reward versus time is not in the favour of the sanctions at this point in time. And this has been a very rough day for Ukraine. And what I'll say is nothing yet has been set in stone, but Zelensky is not happy about these meetings, to the point where he's even cancelled his own trip to Saudi Arabia, saying this, that we were not invited to this Russian-American meeting in Saudi Arabia. It was a surprise for us. I think it was a surprise for many people. We are absolutely honest and open. I don't want any coincidences. That's why I'm not going to Saudi Arabia. Although we did talk yesterday that Zelensky said he would ask His Majesty of Saudi Arabia about what happened in the talks. And no, this meeting was not a surprise, and it's still grey if Ukraine was invited or not, but it depending, the Russia wasn't invited to the peace summit, which, I highly criticise not having a party there in the peace summit. And as well, I think Ukraine maybe should have been there. But again, this wasn't a peace summit. This was a bilateral meeting to see, are the Russians interested in peace at all? Zelensky will now visit Saudi Arabia on March 10th, which lines up with this big dog's birthday. So on that day, don't bloody forget about old Willie. So let's continue on this. Now, Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, he has spoken about then energy and further strikes. According to Lavrov, and this was reported by RT, US diplomats suggested putting moratorium, which is basically a temporary prohibition of an activity on energy infrastructure during Tuesday's bilateral talks. Now, of course, we see Russia have a lot of strikes against Ukrainian facilities, and Ukraine is having an increase in strikes on Russian energy facilities. Now, Lavrov says, we explained that we never jeopardise the systems which supply power for their population, adding that Russia only targeted those objects that directly serve the armed forces of Ukraine. Now, of course, these strikes jeopardised civilian power. We see hundreds of thousands to millions out of power every few nights. And of course, this in turn lowers morale, which can lower a whole bunch of things for the military. But also, does the military use these energy facilities? Absolutely they do. So under the law, these strikes, these are seen as legal as much as anything in war can be, due to energy being dual use. Have a look back at then operations around the world in other areas, and energy is one of the first things you hit, and dual use can be claimed under any of this, and especially into the future as more and more military items need power. Now, I'm not justifying these strikes at all. To say that they never jeopardise these systems for civilian power is incorrect, but striking an energy facility in a war is definitely allowed per se. The diplomat praised the highly productive talks with the US side. Not only did we listen, but we genuinely heard each other. It was asked by a journalist about attempts to torpedo the re-established diplomatic contact between Moscow and Washington. Lavrov noted that to prevent this, relations need to be fine-tuned. That is what we did today. Frankly, not without success. And what they're getting to is along the lines of what the Hungarian foreign minister said 3 days ago, where he said Europe will do all that they can to undermine any negotiations and the continuation of the war. Europe has put sort of all its chips in here, and I think it's going to find them very, very difficult to pull these back out. Now, of course, Mr. Rubio, he described a 3-step plan in this. That firstly, both countries would negotiate how to remove restrictions placed on each other's embassies in Moscow. These have skeleton staffs due to a lot of people being kicked out and coming in. He said the US would engage with Russia around parameters of what an end to the Ukraine war would look like. So what are you prepared to do? There's going to be an engagement and consultation with Ukraine, with our partners in Europe and others. But ultimately, the Russian side will be indispensable to this effort. So you can't have this Swiss hand shandy-a-thon if Russia's not there and call it then a peace summit, which, of course, you couldn't have called this a peace meeting if Ukraine isn't there. Finally, he said Russia and the United States would explore new partnerships, both in geopolitics and in business. He described them as extraordinary opportunities that exist should this conflict come to an acceptable end. And that's where we pull out that sanctions then are going to have to be lifted. But there is some trouble in paradise, and there is growing tension between Zelensky and Trump. Absolutely. And I'm sure you've seen some snippets of some of the things Trump has said in his press interview today. And of course, this has thrown many into a flat spin online, or many taking that to exploit that morale informational opportunity as well. Okay. So let's look at then this. Now, this is then one of the things that Trump has said. We have a situation where we haven't had elections in Ukraine, where we have martial law. Well, essentially martial law. We have martial law, where the leader in Ukraine, I hate to say, but he's down at a 4% approval rating. Now, the latest polls show 52%, but what I should say, and I think no one better than Trump would know this, don't trust polls. Polls, all over the place. You never know where they're asking it, how they're asking it, all of that. So he says 4%, polls say 52%. Truth is, we do not know. But what we do know, even by that poll, is Zelensky was at 77, now down at 52, and is slipping rearwards. I would say that, they want a seat at the table. You could say the people have to. Wouldn't the people of Ukraine have to say it's been a long time since we've had an election? Now, that's not a Russia thing. That's something coming from me and coming from many other countries. That he wants an election, that Trump wants an election in Ukraine. But this is two-pronged, because the rhetoric around this war is that it is upholding democracy in Ukraine. But the thing is, if you suggest having elections in Ukraine, instantly it's a Kremlin talking point. But the second prong of this is the other side, is elections definitely do benefit Putin as well. So it's really, really difficult, and where you weigh this up. And of course, like we said, they point at, and I believe this was from CNN, they talked that this was out of Vladimir Putin's phone call last week, that reiterating the point around elections. But this tension that we see here is serious and has huge effects on the front line of what we are seeing. And what I'll say is the quote I said the other day, a soldier signs up to fight, not to be sacrificed to the altar of a leader's ego. And the future of this, I think, is going to be very, very messy. If I was in Zelensky's shoes, and God, I'm glad I'm not, he's got an incredibly tough job, but I wouldn't want to be burning every bridge that I see with the United States. Because in my opinion, the European Union, they're not willing or able to backfill that. People say, well, they've said they're willing. Well, that's rhetoric, because have we actually seen Europe take a serious enough steps to prove that? In my opinion, no. They could have deployed forces. They could have sent a heap of weapons. They could have mobilised a shitload more money into NATO and to Ukraine. And there's a rhetoric versus reality with Europe's closest allies in Europe that I think is a bit of stabbing in the back for good brownie points for leaders' ego than betraying on the battlefield. Now, this was the press release from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that Putin and Trump step up contacts to discuss international issues and bilateral agenda, prospects of normalising bilateral relations, and respective ambassadors as soon as possible, and start consultations at the level of deputy foreign ministers to remove restrictions on activities of diplomatic missions of the two countries, and identify ways to resume cooperation in the economy, energy, outer space exploration, and other areas of mutual interest. US mutual interest here is then trying to at least pump the brakes and slow down China's rise. The sides agreed to resume communication channels to discuss other international issues, being mindful of Russia and the United States' special responsibility in matters of peace, security as nuclear powers and permanent members of the UN Security Council. But then this paragraph in here, that they say they want to eliminate the root causes of the conflict to create proper conditions for achieving a lasting and enduring peace. Now, Trump, as well as Putin, they will say the root cause here is NATO membership. And, of course, out of these meetings, wanting to cancel the promise back in 2008 of this membership. So I think that is going to be the starting point for the US and Russia. Let's look at some of the Department of State talks in this interview here. Now, this interview was done by CNN and the Associated Press, but what does a successful end look like? Did you present any proposals to the Russians today? They want a permanent end to this. We know just the practical reality is there's going to have to be some discussion of territory and security guarantees. These are very political answers given in this. The president has stated his desire, determination to end the war and end the killing. It's not in the interest of the world, and it's not in the interest of the US and Europe. And Trump is determined to move very quickly and establish and stabilise productive relationships moving forward. They ask about, will Russia retain any territory annexed since the beginning of the war? He says these are to be discussed, and President did not find acceptable to an endless war in Europe. But as far as he doesn't give like a clear yes or no to this, I will. Yes, there's going to be a retain definitely of some territory if the guns fall silent. If they don't fall silent, well, the war will then continue, and Trump's not going to be happy about that. A few months, President Trump has shifted the entire global conversation from not if the war is going to end, but just how it is going to end, and only President Trump can do that. Both President Putin and Zelensky both said to him, only you, President Trump, can drive this war to a conclusion. But of course, their separate conclusions are very, very far apart. Now, what concessions do you expect of the Russians? We're not going to pre-negotiate it or an end to the conflict. But hard diplomacy in closed rooms is going to take place. That in order for the conflict to end, everyone involved in the conflict has to be okay with it and has to be acceptable to them. This is where the biggest problem is that many see is, well, that is so far apart at this point in time. Can there be any real end without internal unrest as well? So the goal of today's meeting was to follow up the phone call the president had a week ago to begin to establish those lines of communications. Sanction relief is going to be involved in any of this normalising. Did the Russians bring up sanctions relief in the meeting today? Sanctions are all a result of this conflict. So they're a result of the conflict. In order to bring an end to any conflict, there has to be concessions made by allies and also other parties to the sanctions. The European Union is going to have to be at the table because they have sanctions as well that have to be imposed. The goal is to bring an end to the conflict in a way that is fair. So in this, we can say, yes, they want a fair but quick end to this. We know who's in a position of power and that there will be some sanctions lifted, but they need Europe involved in those sanctions as well, of course, in global trade. Now, Trump, he has really, really stirred up a lot of people online with a lot of comments made in this press conference today. Now, he claims that Russia is bombing only at 20% capacity, not 100% capacity. Now, it's so hard to know when Trump is just talking shit or when he's got legitimate intel out on any of this. And he says they haven't done it in Kyiv because they don't want to shoot too many rockets in there. So what do we know? Well, we don't really know. But what we do know is somewhere between being out of missiles in 2022 and what Trump is saying that they're only at 20%. Zelensky said last week he doesn't know where half the money went. I believe that we gave $350 billion. He said maybe it's a bit less than that, but that we have to equalise with Europe. And he's been highly critical of Europe giving $100 billion, who is far more close to Ukraine, who it affects far more, and the US being, well, by his numbers, 3 to 3.5 times over that. And he has a bit of a dig at Zelensky in a couple of occasions here. He said, I like him personally, he's fine. But I don't care about personally, I care about getting the job done. And then I hear, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it. You should never have started it. You could have made a deal. So saying Zelensky started it, you should have made a deal and you should have ended it. So, of course, that has erupted online. It'll be very interesting to see what Zelensky comes back to this. But in the period of burning bridges, it's going to be very, very difficult at this point. But I wanted to give a bit of a... let's do this. I wanted to give a bit of a theory think tank. I'm not that I actually think this or believe this, but I want to share it with you and see, I guess, your response to this. That Trump and Zelensky's relationship is absolutely strained. The US and Europe's relationship, or the EU's, is also strained. Of course, with Vice President J.D. Vance suggesting that they now don't share the same shared democratic values. And what we've seen is we've seen the EU grow further liberal, left, progressive, or my preferred term, postmodern, postmodernist, which knowledge then is relative to experience or feelings rather than objective truths. We've seen that real movement in Europe. But the US, they are moving further right or conservative, or preferred term, traditionalist, which comes down to the advocate of maintaining tradition, especially so as to resist change. So there's very different frictions being made here and differences as well. Now, what we have seen is we've seen Putin publicly painting Russia as a bastion of traditional values from the, quote, satanic West, from this postmodernism. But could we see a time, at least on the surface, that Trump's traditional conservative values align more closely with Russia's at least claimed traditionalist conservative values? Of course, there's a lot of areas in here where there's no lining up, as freedom of elections, freedom of press and speech, all things Americans hold incredibly dearly, but also things that J.D. Vance has criticised Europe of abandoning. And he's criticised Europe of abandoning freedom of press, freedom of speech, and freedom of elections with Georgescu in Romania. And this is the horseshoe theory, where you have the extremes of right and left are actually far closer than you would think. So could we see US relationships moving a bit further east on current trajectories, which is growing closer in many aspects? Russia and US, or US and the EU? Just that's a question to you. Where do you think is moving on the current trajectories closer? This is why I think there is a real danger of non-major powers like Slovakia, Hungary, Romania being pulled into Russia's orbit. I'm not suggesting this short term, but I'm suggesting this could happen over decades or years. It needs to be very careful of this because the US can stand on its own 2 feet and be completely self-sufficient. These other smaller states cannot be in a modern world, so it will have to fall into an orbit. And could we see that painting of those values really change? Not because they may align with it, but they align less. They align more with it and less with the values than the west of Europe. And I think there's real threat of that, although it might sound out there conspiratorial. It's something I believe we really need to keep an eye on and people need to actually be careful about. So let's look at threats and false flags as well. I shouldn't have left it to 40 minutes in because this took me a lot of time. But I want to look at this and why I believe this is a critical threat right now. Now, I used AI to assist me with writing this due to my shit spelling and grammar. I'm a soldier, not an academic. But these are the false flag attacks, reasons, timing, risks, and a double false flag. I don't know if that is a term that I've made up or if it is a real term, but I'll explain what I'm getting at. Now, the reasons for a false flag attack. Justify military intervention, too late for that. Manipulate public opinion and gain domestic or international support for a specific agenda. So there's highly chances of that. Distract from internal issues, scandals, or political instability to provoke a conflict or escalate tensions between rival groups or nations. When a false flag tactic may be employed, heighten geopolitical tension or conflict, to then go into reasons to gain international or domestic support. When a government or group seeks to consolidate power or suppress dissent prior to elections or major political events to sway public sentiment, when there is a need to create a pretext for policy changes, increased surveillance or martial law, in situations where direct action would be politically or morally unacceptable without further justifications. Now, there's, of course, potential to backfire in this. If evidence of the false flag is uncovered, it can lead to a loss of credibility and trust in the perpetrators. And it can strengthen of opposition groups or nations who use the exposure as propaganda. So, of course, backfire. Nord Stream, perfect example of this. That's why we hear von der Leyen and others never speak about it, but of course on the other side, always then speaking about it. And I believe that it's not spoken about enough in the West. It is a major thing that took place, even just on an environmental factor. But this is something else that I want to bring into play, is the double false flag, an attack designed to look then like a failed false flag to discredit the other side. Now, this is a more complex tactic where an attack is staged to appear as though it was an intended false flag, but it was poorly executed and therefore exposed. Now, it can discredit the enemy, it can discredit conspiracy theories, or sow distrust among rival groups. But it comes with a lot of risks. It is very complicated to do. It can overcomplicate the narrative. It can alienate your allies and supporters, and potential for true nature of the attack to be revealed. So what am I getting at here? It's when X country have an X false flag to make it look like it was Y countries to do. It's hard to explain, but the recent Chernobyl attack could be seen as this. Did Ukraine conduct a false flag? So this is a Russian drone hitting this area to rally international support or rally domestic support as well? Or did Russia conduct an attack on Chernobyl that appears to be a Ukrainian false flag on the surface? So it actually is a Russian drone, but they're saying it's a Ukrainian false flag to discredit Ukraine. So the double false flag. Now, I know this is out there, but again, we have to take into account a lot of this. We're not dealing with dickheads on Twitter like most people are. We're dealing at the end of the day here with state intelligence operations as well, and billions and billions and billions of dollars and trillions of dollars stand to be gained by maintaining or taking back land. Now, some claim Nord Stream was actually this to discredit Ukraine. People claim that there was Russian operatives. They conducted a Ukrainian false flag. So it was Russian operatives conducted a false flag, then became a double false flag. They left behind breadcrumbs of Ukrainian evidence to discredit Ukraine and put in jeopardy, potentially, German support for Ukraine. Given the evidence and then the EU covering this up, I believe that is unlikely, but it's all things to look out for. Now, conclusions. False flags are high-risk, high-reward strategies that rely on deception and manipulation. But at this point in time, well, the risk of what is occurring with these talks couldn't be higher. Of course, their success depends on controlling the narrative and preventing exposure. Now, this is where Ukraine will have all the success in the world because the mainstream Western media will just suck up any of that. Look at any of these things that it's just been painted instantly as one way, even if there's very, very little evidence beyond reasonable doubt in any point. So, yeah, Ukraine's going to have more success with it. I believe it is a real threat at this point in time. I can't really see why Russia would at this point. They're sort of getting everything they would. That's why I said Chernobyl is awful sus. But we will wait and see. Now, people have spoken about this a lot that I've seen online about nuclear threats. Now, again, I don't believe there's much threat here. I believe this is highly unlikely. Russia's nuclear doctrine, official nuclear doctrine, is a threat to the state of the Russian Federation, or the existence of the state, which Kursk never risked. This war is not risking, at least militarily. Economically, we will see. It's hard to tell. But people look at this because this is like an unofficial part of doctrine that some claim is there and some don't. But Russia's escalate to de-escalate nuclear strategy, that they may use a limited nuclear strike early in a conflict to force an enemy, example NATO, to back down rather than escalate further because of the growing assured destruction that would come from this. The speculation is that if Russia feels it's losing a conventional war, Russia does not feel like they're losing this at the moment, but that it could use a small tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield, not dropping on the city, dropping on the battlefield. It will shock the enemy and allies so much that they will be forced to negotiate and continuing the fight. So to scare them so much into, hey, we don't want that sort of smoke, let's have a negotiation. Now, Russia doesn't feel like it's losing the war at the current time. But we have heard through the end of 22, Kherson and Kharkiv, that the US hinted that there was real threat of this, and could that have actually been a real threat at the time too? Now, Russia officially denies this doctrine exists, and some analysts argue it's a misunderstanding of their actual nuclear policy, outside of the saber rattling, which I think nuclear saber rattling against Trump will be far more effective than against Biden. One, he's cognizant, but secondly, two, Trump is very concerned about then this war spilling over borders and a third world war. But what these analysts who say it's misunderstanding, their view is it is high risk to low gain. Even using a small nuclear weapon would be a massive global escalation, likely triggering NATO retaliation. You're taking a fucking big gamble. And in not striking, if you don't strike, it'll isolate Russia even further. Many believe Moscow understands this risk and would avoid it. So, but in this, many question, and Professor Mearsheimer is one of these, if NATO would actually respond given to the mutually assured destruction. How would they actually respond? Would they sort of bend over, or would they take an aggressive stance? I'm probably more on the former of that, taking of what we have seen so far. But Trump is highly concerned of World War III, so saber rattling will work more. But the post-strike fallout, political, for the next decades would be absolutely unfathomably large as well. So I think all this is highly unlikely at this point in time because Russia does not see that it's losing the conventional or attritional war, and I would agree with that in my analysis they are not losing the attritional or conventional war at this point in time, and I believe therefore it's highly unlikely. If it was in different areas, then maybe not, if the existence of the state was really there. This is why some have said, could Ukraine have ever really won by defeating Russia? Because how would that actually look? How would the US then see that if there was threat of that? But I do think it is likely, near negotiations, we may see Russia drop multiple Otoshniks. This would have an effect on how things are seen. If they can drop multiple of those, we know that would have influence on Trump's concerns about raising the war and comments he's made about 20% instead of 100% of bombing, maybe that. And leading into these, we'll see Russia push, I believe, very hard on the front line to try and show, look, we're taking back this amount of ground. It's only going to take us 6 months to get to this, even if they can buff up that kilometre squares for a couple of weeks to show that. Like when people get a mortgage and for a couple of months you sort of don't spend much money to show the bank, hey, look, I'm not even spending that much. But in the reverse side of this. So, Legends, a lot that we've gone over in that, but we always have a lot because I believe there's so much to be added in this, even if it massively affects my views. But Legends, who cares? Have a great time. Look after yourselves, and I'll keep you updated with what comes. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.